In my first video, the John and Carrie generation, I discussed the lives of John and Carrie Cushing, my great-great-grandfather and his wife Carrie, along with their children and grandchildren. In this video, I'm going to explore the family in which John came from, his parents, grandparents, and even some of his aunts and uncles. Their stories, their lives, which ultimately helped us form the people we are today. When John died in 1925, followed by his wife Carrie in 1934, they were both buried side by side in plots set aside for them from years before. A parcel of land purchased by his grandfather Thomas Wiley more than 75 years earlier, it would be located at the Forest Hill Cemetery in Roxbury, Mass., an area that his wife Margaret and their family would for a long time call home. The plots set aside at Forest Hills would be for his children and grandchildren. But would also later include some of his great-grandchildren and even one of their children. John's grandfather, on his mother's side, was Thomas Wiley, a wealthy treasurer for the Fitchburg Railroad in the earliest years during the formation of the railroad industry. It stretched from Boston to Fitchburg, Massachusetts. During his life, Thomas Wiley would ultimately have 11 children with his wife Margaret Wright, living comfortably in Boston until 1849, when they would face the first death of one of their children. It was their 30-year-old son, John Wiley, a printer, who would die of typhoid fever. Arrangements needed to be made. Thomas had 11 children after all, and wanted to provide enough space for all of them. So Thomas and Margaret bought enough land so their entire family could always stay together. All was good in the Wiley household after the death of their son John for 7 years, until 1856, when one of their youngest children, George, died. His death was listed as consumption, known as TB today. He was only 27. George's occupation was listed as agent and had traveled to England the same year his brother John had died in 1849. The year was 1860 and the country was on the brink of civil war. Thomas and Margaret were still living in Roxbury near Boston. They still had 3 children living with them. Their oldest daughter Mary, their youngest daughter Anna, and their son Adams. Adams was one of a set of fraternal twins born on November 16, 1826. Both brothers were to be named after U.S. presidents, Adams and Jefferson. Adams was a doctor, a very hazardous job in its day because he always had the risk of becoming infected by the patients he treated. Well, in April of 1860, that risk caught up with him, and Adams became infected with TB and died. He was laid to rest by his family on May 13th in the family plot. Then, just 12 days later, the father who had just buried his son, the proprietor of the plots, also died. The cause of death was listed as old age, but grief certainly must have taken its part. Over the years, as time passed on, and Thomas and Margaret's children passed away, the unfortunate inevitability that some of their children may move far away or create families of their own, not making it practical to be with their parents, Thomas and Margaret, in the final end. However, This inevitability created space for the future generations of our family, which welcomed the openings. While some of Thomas's and Margaret's children did take advantage of the space allotted to them by their parents, others did not. The first to take advantage of these openings were my 3 times great-grandparents, Thomas's daughter, Margaret, and her husband, William Cushing. The Cushings, keeping their proximity close to Cambridge and keeping near to their family roots, would continue using the unused spaces over the years. For the next to fill it was their daughter Catherine, known as Kate, who died in 1913. She remained single, living at home with her parents, and working as a school teacher her entire life. Soon to follow was their eldest son, Charles. Charles, too, remained single and was an ensign for the Navy in the Civil War. Eventually, John and Carrie's granddaughter, Cassie, would take her space after being hit by a car in 1917 in the twilight years of the automobile industry. She was just age 5. In 1960, John's second youngest sister, Edith, took her place. Edith, during her lifetime, would earn a master's degree from Radcliffe College and go on to be a high school teacher. She lived to the ripe old age of 98. Lastly, John and Carrie's daughter, Dorothea Cushing, also a graduate from Radcliffe College, filled the final plot in 1972, completing 4 generations of our family to be remembered. William was the firstborn living son of Thomas and Margaret. He was born on March 13, 1813, when Margaret was just 21. In 1840, William married Anna Brooks and had 4 children: Sarah, William, John, and Maria. They would eventually all settle in Detroit, Michigan by 1850, but Anna would die in 1853. William would remarry that same year to Elizabeth Kimball. In the 1860s, the war had started, and William's 2 sons wanted to support the cause. William Jr. would muster in as a private on July of 1862. He would later fight the Battle of Murfreesboro in Tennessee and would pay the ultimate sacrifice in December of that same year. John seemed to have joined the cause from the state in which he was born, New York. He would survive the war and not be the hero his brother William was, and later suffer. In the 1880 census, John appears twice. One with his family in Illinois, with his wife and daughter Minnie, and one at the same time in Kalamazoo, Michigan, in an insane asylum. John's wife must have assumed that John was coming back, but he never would. He would remain there in the insane asylum for the rest of his life until 1909, when John decided he couldn't take the pain any longer and hung himself. Margaret Wright was the wife to Thomas Wiley and grandmother to John Eliot Cushing. In the 1860s, she and her family lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and were very close to the rest of her family, who also lived nearby. John Eliot's father, William Cushing, was the minister for the Unitarian Church in Cambridge, and the entire family had very strong abolitionist beliefs. Margaret kept a photo collection of over 300 photos. Most were of family members, but a few were not. 2 photos in particular stood out, one of which was a photo of Sojourner Truth. She would play a vital role in recruiting black soldiers for Union troops during the Civil War. The other one was of Robert Gould Shaw, best known for Matthew Broderick's portrayal of him in the movie Glory, where the colonel leads the first all-black regiment of African-American soldiers in the Civil War to their death, including himself, in the fight for freedom. Robert and his family were prominent abolitionists and lived in Cambridge. In addition, they were also Unitarians and attended the church where John's father, William Cushing, was the minister. But that's not all they had in common. Now, Margaret had a brother. Although it is not known if they were actually Unitarian, they did live in Cambridge and also had very strong abolitionist beliefs. His name was Edmund Wright, and he was the owner and publisher of the Boston Daily Patriot. His wife was Sarah Hunt, a prominent doctor, an unusual trait for a woman in that day. Together, they had 4 sons, 2 of which would become officers or U.S. colored troops for the North during the Civil War. The first son to enlist was his middle son, Augustus. He was just 16 years when he joined the cavalry as a private in September of 1863. He would serve for 2 years before becoming a first lieutenant for the 24th Regiment in the U.S. Colored Infantry. He would be wounded in April of 1864, but would survive the war. After the war, he lived a productive life, marrying Julia Billings in 1868, only to lose her to TB in 1 year's time. He would remarry and have 1 son, Edmund, but the years of tragedy must have taken their toll, for Augustus would die of cirrhosis of the liver at age 58. Edmund's son Theodore was the next to enlist. Theodore had been attending the nearby Harvard College when in the spring of 1864 he wrote in his journal, "I have for some time been deliberating about leaving college to go to the war, and I have, at last, with the consent of my parents, determined to study for a commission in the colored troops." So Theodore followed his younger brother's lead and became a first lieutenant of the 108th Regiment, Company F. In March of 1865, he photographed his entire troop at his own expense. He even wrote personal notes of each soldier on the back, describing and praising each individual. When the album was complete, he presented it to his mother, who would die only 4 years later. The collection now lies at Yale University. We have now, in 2 videos, explored over 100 years and 5 generations of John Eliot Cushing's family. From my own grandfather to my 4 times great-grandfather. And even though I was never even alive to know most of these people, the making of these 2 videos has brought me closer to them all, helping me appreciate the joys and the pains of their lives. Someone once said, "We all die twice. Once when our souls leave our bodies, and once when our name is spoken for the last time." If that is true, then hopefully they will all continue to live on.